The quality of the presentations has been absolutely fantastic. We have heard about systems thinking with respect to how our clinical trial system is working. We were provided with fantastic examples of implementation and how embedded clinical trials work in a national healthcare system when we heard from Dr. Pipakori yesterday. We heard, of course, also from our funders and all of the activities that they are looking to do in order to address some of the gaps that exist in Canada with respect to clinical trial funds. And this is where I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive. We've heard about the different types of project funding that are coming out of the CIHR, but what we'll hear from today here is the work that's being done to support training of individuals that are carrying out these different clinical trials and other groups that are working on patient engagement and what this looks like in the context of the CIHR SPORE, or the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research. We'll also hear from our target audience in all of this work, which is patients. Right? We've heard a lot about patients and about patient centricity, about patient engagement, about patient collaboration. But what does this all mean? And I'm really pleased that we have Camille Leahy here, who I've gotten to know really well, because she is a patient that has participated in a clinical trial that's funded by my organization. And right beside her is Dr. Manoj Lalu, who played a critical role in the design of what that clinical trial protocol was going to look like. So what I would like to begin with is to have each member of this panel who play a critical role in the innovation and clinical trial ecosystem that are really tackling some of the big challenges that we have with respect to patient engagement, training, clinical trial protocol design. How do we get patient groups better engaged in the clinical trial engine that is here in Canada? And so I would like each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and also to speak about their own institutional perspective and describe to the room a little bit of the role that they play in the ecosystem. So I'm going to start with you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you. So I'm based at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, where my role is the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Program Facilitator. So what that means in real terms is I often consult with our clinician scientists, researchers, about their research studies, how they can make their research more patient-oriented, how they can engage patients in the studies. But then we also do outreach education, and we actually do a lot of work to sort of match or identify patient partners to work with research teams as well. So they're the sort of three main areas of work that we do. I'm also part of the Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium, where I sit on the operations committee, but also I'm a member of the patient engagement working group and the IDEA, which is Inclusivity, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility working group. So trying to bring all those different pieces together. So if you want me to stop there and let everyone else.
Yes, is this one working? Yay. Hi, so a lot of you know me because I sometimes talk a little bit, but however, I am representing CIHR funded project called CanTrain, and it's a clinical pan-Canadian consortium for training programs for diverse sector groups across the country. And I'm a patient also, as you well know, so I was part of the here's what really, really went well, and here's the one thing that maybe they could improve better next time. The reason that I got invited to be a patient co-investigator in this CIHR grant is because of networking, and because I was on CIHR's MHA, the Institute of Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis Institute Advisory Board, which I'm still a board member. And one of the co-investigators, Dr. Suzanne Morin from McGill here, asked me to be part of this and would I be interested, and I asked her to explain explain it a little bit. And I said, I'd be very interested. Thank you so much for the ask. At that time, the grant was about 80% written, and I hadn't been part of it. So I'd say that's the only lesson that I'd suggest, that we really have to get patients earlier. However, I said, you know what, it's really good. I want to be part of it. This is something that we have to do. Let's go for it. So I signed the grant, signed my part 24 hours before it was to be submitted. And lo and behold, I became a patient investigator because of that. But I wouldn't have done that had I not joined IMHA's, MHA's, PERA group, which is Patient Engagement Research Ambassador. And sorry to you that have said we have too many acronyms. We do. So I did that. But as part of CanTrain, really, what we're focusing on is 4 different groups. Trialists is the group number 1. The second group is clinical research professionals, which are diverse people across the country. A lot of them are nurses or science-based that run the operational side of clinical trials while they're going on. The third group is graduate students and postdoc fellows. And then the fourth group is community partners, patients, patient organizations, sponsors, a very diverse group, as diverse as healthcare lawyers and healthcare journalists, to get media, simple language output out there. And that's how I met Barry. Barry sits on the Governance Council. We're both patient partners in the Governance Council, and I also sit in the mentoring group, the EDIA, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility group, mainly for the accessibility aspect because I have invisible disabilities, as well as I co-chair nationally with Dr. Christina Fahim from Toronto, Working Group 9, which is the CAN Partner Group. We have some other members that have been in the audience over the past few days, and that is a group of 16 people, 8 family and patient members, and 8 clinical scientists or academics. So I would say through this grant, CIHR, which is a 3-year grant for us, it's just over $11 million that we have for it, putting together a competency-based, pan-Canadian training program focused in 4 different sectors of absolute need in a modular format of free educational online modules. And there's going to be a common aspect to them, and then there's going to be graded aspect. And I'll just close in this part by saying for patients, the 3 branches that we're going to have for educational purposes, and the patients means more than just patients, as you know we've been saying, it's going to be patient advocacy, patient partnership in research trials so that we can create patient research fellows in Canada. And then the third group is going to be general patient engagement in Canada. So yes, we have to increase participation rates, but my goodness, we have to increase rates of complete partnership with patients and researchers, starting with blue sky thinking. Thank you.
Be part of the discussion a little bit later on about the different levels of engagement. Camille, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Camille Leahy, and I'm a patient advocate. I participated in the first Made in Canada CAR T-cell trial at the Ottawa Hospital, funded by BioCanRx. My goal now, I'm here because I want to advocate for other patients. Part of what's important to my story is how I had to advocate for myself to get into this clinical trial. I didn't know that standard care was not the only option until I refused the standard of care. It was only then that I was, and not even that I was given any idea of what to do next. I feel like I did everything at that point for myself. I remembered a doctor mentioning CAR T-cell before I had done a stem cell transplant, but I, at that time, didn't think anything of it because I believed that that stem cell transplant would be my cure. It wasn't until I was offered hyper-CVAD, which to me was just very similar to the original treatment that I had gotten at the beginning of my diagnosis. And when they listed off a lot of the chemotherapies, when I heard them, I just didn't make sense to me why I would be trying something that didn't work first time. I knew my options were limited. I was denied different kinds of medications because I was told that, you know, they didn't think it would work for me. They were too costly. It was then that I researched CAR T cell, and I began asking questions, and I was led to the Ottawa Hospital, where they just so happened to have a clinical trial. I had a family member that worked at the Ottawa Hospital, who I'm very close with, who also helped advocate for me to get into this trial. I don't know why it wasn't brought to my attention. I know other people have mentioned, I don't know if it's maybe because my doctors didn't think that I would have access to these clinical trials, or like if I didn't have a place to stay or any support. But I think that should be left up to the patient to make that decision. So anyway, what I think is at the beginning of diagnosis, I think all options should be put on the table for patients, so that when the time comes, God forbid, the standard line of treatment doesn't work, these options have already been presented to us and that we know that they exist. Because like I said, if it wasn't for that one doctor who had just mentioned CAR T to me, I don't think I would have asked. I would have had no idea that that even existed. I was doing treatment during a pandemic where I didn't have family with me to support me and to help me navigate the healthcare system and figure out where my next, my next option was coming from. But anyhow, I'm thankful to be here, and my goal again is just to continue to advocate for patients.
Thank you so much, Camille. Thank you for sharing that. Manoj.
Thanks, Stephanie. So Manoj Lalu, I'm an anesthesiologist and a scientist at OHRI. So I was part of the team for the CLIC 1901 trial, which Camille was speaking about there. It was led by Natasha Kekri. She's the actual clinician in charge of that, but BioCanRx funded my research group to conduct a number of enabling studies that helped refine and optimize the design of the CLIC 1901 trial. And I guess in terms of patient engagement, I started in the space funded by BioCan and a couple other organizations. And when we started all of this 7 years ago now, it was interesting because a lot of people didn't even know what patient engagement was. I think the landscape has dramatically changed over the last 7 years. And a lot of it has to do with the underlying reasons we've discussed today in terms of different pressures being put on different stakeholders, right, to make this happen. So it's been really exciting to see it develop, and we've now been involved in helping enable patient engagement in early phase clinical trials, several of them now, all academic at early phase clinical trials. And we're actually even pushing the envelope a bit more. So we were just funded by CIHR and the Stem Cell Network to look at patient engagement in basic science now. So pushing it even further into the preclinical space. So anyways, I guess I'll let to say that patient engagement is a major focus of our research group.
Barry, thanks for
So
that.
I didn't realize that it was exactly 7 years ago when we started our conferences that this is when we all began to work together. So Camille, great, I would say story, but it's not a story, it's real life. And it's an amazing experience that I led on, that I had a similar type of experience at the time when there were no treatments for metastatic colon cancer, really, other than the basic 5-FU at the time, back in 1995. And so I did have to advocate for myself, but I didn't really think of it as advocacy. I thought of it as, I just got to find something to save my life. And for my family, I was thinking about it at the time as well. And what that led me to do was to do some weird things. Like I just called up Sanofi, a company in the United States, and I said, I understand you have this, this product oxaliplatin, which is now standard of care, and, can I get it? And they said, well, we don't have any trials in Canada. I said, well, let's start one. Let's do one. Well, we just completed one, and I don't know if we can do it together. But I convinced my oncologist, well, it was Jerry at the time, but it was Jean Latreille, who now heads up the cancer agency here in Quebec, PQC, that we should get it started at a small hospital called Hotel Dieu at the time. and that was the first experience with a clinical trial around the year 2000, actually. The second experience was in the United States, because I did have to leave the country for care, for my care actually, down to New York, and then subsequently to California, where I participated in a vaccine trial. And this was word of mouth. This is how I found out about all these things, was just really word of mouth. We had something called listserv, where we get all these emails from different patients in the ACOR listing, and that's how we found out about these innovations. So there were two things. I didn't even know what a clinical trial was. I was just looking for something. I wasn't even thinking of it as a clinical trial. I was thinking of it, I got to get this drug or this treatment in order to have a chance, because the 5-year survival rate was 15%. So I knew I definitely had to do something, and my expression was, just don't sit there, stupid, do something. And that was my motivation, but I realized I had no information on clinical trials. No one was telling me. I was just looking for a cure. So there is this lack of information. I had no one to help navigate, like even to find a trial. I think we were looking at, possibly I was looking at clinicaltrials.gov, but just not even knowing what I was looking at. So I had no means of navigating for the trial. And how I got into the trial, I actually don't know, but it just happened that they agreed. But technically, one of the problems is not only just finding the trial, but actually getting into the trial, the experience that you had. So you knew about the trial, but then you had to advocate to actually get into the trial, to qualify for the trial. So some of those needs today are being met, and I think we can do, and Stuart, you said you're going to do a lot more in terms of public campaign, in terms of awareness. QCRO, I know we do that, and that's happening here in Quebec, and Catalyst and other 3CTN and N2, and there's other organizations, BioCan and so forth, that are doing that. But I think we have to sort of speak as a unified voice if we're going to make a difference, even at the institutions, whether Sunnybrook, the Jewish, MUHC, SHUM, and so forth. They all do it individually. But if we can act collectively, we can certainly create some awareness. The second part, in terms of the navigation, there's so little of it in Canada in helping patients and even healthcare physicians identify trials for patients. And that's where QCRO has started a program here in Quebec, and Catalyst and Dr. Carolyn Ham in Ontario, and we're trying to, it's not an easy thing to do. We'd like to create a community of practice among those existing navigators and then train other people who could navigate for patients and healthcare physicians. So this is a big gap that's missing. And then even once all that's done, you take a look at the numbers about people who've gone through it and they know about the trials and they find a trial, the number is dismal as to actually how many people actually get into the trial or don't die before they get into the trial. And that's something we really have to work. And that goes to your exact point, that people have to start thinking about trials and identifying with trials when they're diagnosed, not at the end. Because if you're going to wait too late, you're not going to have that opportunity. So, you know, for all the points that you raised, that really, you know, and this was back in '95, and you were only in the last few years, you know, things have changed, but they haven't changed that much where we've made, you know, an impact on the system. And this is actually one of the reasons why we started PACT in the first place.
Barry, and you're so right. And I'd like to ask the question to all of our folks that are engaged in different grants, either supported by the Stem Cell Network or CIHR. You know, you've heard about this very significant challenge. You hear from Barry, and you know, this happened in the mid-90s. You hear from Camille, where, you know, she was the one really to ask her clinicians about this clinical trial. From the perspective of the different, you know, is this on your radar? I'm sure that it is, all of you. And so from the perspective of the work that you're currently doing under different, you know, grants, initiatives that you're, you know, working towards, what are you doing to address this? And or what do you know about other initiatives in Canada to address this really significant gap? Because that low percentage of 2 to 9%, and the stat that I've heard in Canada in terms of clinical trial participation is closer to 4. I haven't seen that number, move very much. And I know that there have been a lot of public, outreach type campaigns, but they fall flat. And yet we have groups like in the UK, where what I'm seeing is, it's on buses. There's a lot of engagement with the public about research being an option. And so I know I'm rolling up a few things, right? It's getting the word out to the public, but then how do we not have another barrier, another Camille happen? And what are your initiatives doing to address that? I don't know who wants to go first.
So I'll just start off by how we started off the whole conference. We need to make trials more accessible. Francois' presentation was very clear, and Pippa's discussion about what's going on in the UK as well, very clear. We have to make them more accessible by making the sites closer to the patient. And I don't know if I'm ever going to forget that picture, Francois, that you had and that Pippa had as well, showing where the disease is and where the clinical trial sites are, right? Not in the same area. People are experiencing their disease all over the place, and yet there's only a very focused few centers. And you think in Canada, what is there, 10 centers that are really, used for clinical trial sites, and in most of the trials, and very little, around them. And this is what has to change. So we have to focus on really it starts with the patient. How is it going to be more accessible for the patient? And I think that's where it begins and that's where it ends.
Comments or your own perspective with respect to the initiatives that you're working on?
Yeah, so I could talk about one or two things through the ACT consortium. So we've talked about the awareness campaign that will be coming. Actually, one of the things that's recently been being put into place now is the idea of what are called portfolio hospitals. So this is kind of drawing on the UK, but recognizing that a lot of the care that's provided in Canada is not provided in these tertiary academic hospitals, community hospitals, other hospitals, but they don't always have the research infrastructure to bring trials to that site, which is bringing it to the patients. So ACT has provided funding to put research support staff into 20 community hospitals across the country to try and bring clinical trials closer to different communities into those hospitals. So that's one way of trying to open up access to clinical trials that's happening through ACT.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I see my orthopedic surgeon a lot, and in my TOH on my chart, every time I have to do a patient satisfaction survey now through surgery, I get a question asked if I'd be interested in participating in clinical trials. So I think someone in the audience kind of mentioned that. So articulating it through to things like patient satisfaction surveys, even if they're not with NRC PIC or just the individual ones that they have, is certainly one way. But one way that we have 4 diverse groups in CanTrain, and it's interesting. When we were talking to clinical research professionals across the country, they said things like, because we're doing a needs assessments in 2 groups, and we're doing a needs assessment for the patient group about clinical trials. I'll talk about that in a sec. But the ones for clinical research professionals and the kind of coordinators that run them, so to speak, they said, that's really, really great, training and everything, and certification. We have no time and we need help on the ground. So, aspects related to what Stuart just said is we need some help of infrastructure, of process, of people, of understanding our workflow before we go ahead and even try to increase to get more people in, because it's going to have to be more, formalized to manage it. But the needs assessment we're doing, we took a list from Cardiff that actually came from Stuart. Stuart and I are working on a few things together. But and then we sent it out to our work group, and we got people to add on. And it was patient-led organizations, small, medium, and large, and disease-specific organizations, small, medium, and large. Because I think a few people have said it's important to have agnostic to disease information about clinical trials. So what is a process of clinical trials? What is the format? What are the frameworks? What do we have to know about it, no matter what disease we have and who we are? And the patients are bringing forward very, very interesting information, and that's why we branched out into, some people are interested in advocacy, and I'll tell you, a lot of people that get into advocacy from a patient perspective get into it at the lowest point in their life. Something dastardly has happened or not happened that they're just about ready to die, or they're just about, honest to God, ready to commit suicide because no one's taking care of them. I mean, it is that bad, and that's when people change their life around and move forward. How are we reaching people to be able to get that? So I think, what do people know or don't know or use or don't use, and what supports the whole aspect of getting messages out about clinical trials? And I think marketing and messaging and common messaging and simplicity and things on, that's not my area of forte, like creativity, but things in buses, getting the message out there. Yeah, there's a lot of simple ways. When I was a nurse, no one ever said, nurses, please go around and find people to see or put information up about clinical trials. Why not? There's thousands and thousands of them. Anyway, so I just think we have to garnish some of these things and bring them together and ask people in those groups.
I couldn't agree more, and also reminding Canadians, they're paying for this research. Right? They're stakeholders to this research. Camille and Manoj.
I mean, I don't want to sound repetitive, but I mean, first of all, before I was sick, I wasn't aware of any of this. So I think that should tell everybody something, is that until you're in that situation, it shouldn't take me being in that situation to become aware of this situation, is what I'm getting at. So I think it's wonderful that you guys have all given me a voice, because I've seen how my voice is being heard. That I never knew anyone was actually listening until I was invited to tell my story everywhere, and I didn't realize what an impact it was making. But I definitely think there just needs to be more awareness, and that's what I'm going to try to help continue to do, is bring awareness to other patients that don't know that there's other options out there. And even if there's not another option, help research get to that place that we want to be.
Well, I guess if the question is how do we get better uptake in trials, right? So one thing from a clinician perspective is make the protocol as simple as possible. So as an anesthesiologist, I've been involved in some very complicated trials and some very simple trials. Simple trials get done. They get done quickly. So one trial that I'm involved in right now, we just simply hang a bag up of tranexamic acid or placebo. We don't know what it is, obviously. Our research assistant hands it to me in the morning if the patient's eligible, and they say this person's eligible. It's actually a waived consent form. Waived consent trial as well too. So that's another aspect. Obviously, can't do that for early phase clinical trials necessarily, but I basically hang it up, and then I can just focus 100% on keeping the patient alive, right, which is what I do as an anesthesiologist, as opposed to some other trials where there's about 10 different things they want me to do, and I'm just looking at it, I'm thinking, okay, there's going to be a lot of protocol deviations today. So I think making it very, very pragmatic is or as pragmatic as possible will help trials have better uptake and better adherence from the clinician perspective as well too. And also the easier it is in terms of getting patients into trials. So at our center, as Stuart mentioned earlier today, in the last few weeks, they just rolled out having research assistants actually approach the patient. So you no longer have to have the circle of care involved, right? So again, just taking the clinician out of it, because we have 20 other things to do often, right? So that having the trial on the first, forefront of our mind is not always there. So just a couple of thoughts.
I'd just like to add a little experience, and that this might help the conversation as well. A patient called up and said, can you find me a trial? I had not been advised anything by my doctor, and I don't even know if I can get into trial, but is there anything you can do to help? So I went on clinicaltrials.gov, I went on the Onco Quebec site here in Quebec, and I found the trial. And I said, this trial looks like, it could work for you. It was for a microsatellite stable patient looking for immunotherapy, and there was an actual trial actually going on like that. And so I said, you know, look at the qualifications. I went back to clinicaltrials.gov and I asked a few questions, not in any scientific way whatsoever. It seemed to me that this patient would actually be able to get into this trial or would qualify for the trial, you know, just outwardly based on the facts. So I happen to know the person who is the head of the clinical trials center at that institution, and I called her up and I said, you know, seems, well, actually I couldn't get through to her the first time, but I did get through to an admin person. They said, well, the patient doesn't qualify. I said, well, like, I don't understand why the patient doesn't qualify. Here's the qualifications, what's missing? I'll get back to you. I called up the PI on and I said, I don't understand. This person qualifies. She said, you're right, this person does qualify. Let me speak to my staff. So there's a human problem here. Informed staff, simplification of the protocol, understanding that someone can be on the other end of the line to respond to a question properly and in a timely manner, because time is of the essence in cancer. And so, you know, all things being equal, the person got into the trial. Sadly, the person died before the trial. But the point is that it was a very simple human problem. It wasn't the trial itself. It wasn't the qualifications. It was just a simple ability to not be able to communicate, to receive that query. And I understand they get a lot of questions, you know, from different people, and everybody's busy. But that's the job, right? The job is to get people into the trial. And that very simple human problem, that very just basic facts and communicating with the public is a big problem. And that's why the navigation systems that QCrow and others are working on, navigators, can help that process, but it doesn't help that end part, but getting into the trial.
No, it doesn't. No.
And I just wanted to say, like, totally agree with you what you just said, Barry. Imagine, no, you're not Barry. Imagine that you were running a small, and you're a wonderful guy, right? And you know a lot and you have a lot of contacts. So this is not a criticism, but imagine you're running a small association, totally patient-led, run with no money, all on top of volunteer shoulders with people living with disease, and they get the same number of calls on a weekly basis. Can you help me do this? And they're barely scratching just to support and maybe symptom management or education or what have you. So I hear what you're saying. So what is the end result of a solution to put something together that takes two groups of people that need to know about each other? Researchers running trials, patients are going to be participants in trials, and create something better than the registries that we have right now that are siloed, scattered, and don't cover all diseases. So, you know, yeah, but who's in charge of that, and whose burning platform is that to do something to change that? Because I hear it so much, that's what people want, but who's doing it, so to speak?
Who is doing it? Who is doing it? Who is doing this? Who? Registry work? Yeah, we're just in charge of you know, we have initiatives like ACT, for example. You know, what resounding theme, right, of this conference has been the need for more harmonization, right. And you know, mention of we need this top-down approach, we need this groundswell of support.
Well, it could come under a training program. I don't know if we've identified it as training for speaking to patients or to other navigators, but the whole navigation, training for navigation, I don't think there's training for that. I mean, there's been some local training in Quebec on that, but I don't think there's a training program to be a patient navigator or navigation for healthcare professionals. I think it's learning on the spot, learning how to use the different tools, clinicaltrials.gov, OncoQuebec, or whatever the trial finder is. And Natalie has a comment. Go ahead. Let me bring you the mic. Hold on 1 second.
It's not meant for this. It's not meant for patient navigation. I think that's the key thing. It's a great database, but it's not, and it's terrible to go through. I'd say for cancer, Carolyn Ham is doing it, but that doesn't solve all other non-cancer diseases. So you know, I think it goes back. You know, what is this, who is in charge here, and this is great because it's coming from the patients and going up, but there needs to be someone in charge, and CPAC should probably be doing it for cancer, but it still doesn't take care of the non-cancer. But I say Carolyn's doing it in Ontario, but that's one person.
So that is one person on a grant, on a shoestring, working on it, and we have collaborated, and we have Catherine's been in communication, well, Lucy's been in communication at QCRO as well with Carolyn Ham, and of course 3CTN. Stephen's been helping to fund that as well, but it's one person, right? And there's a lot of patients in the country. Yeah. Yeah. Catherine, would you like to add something? Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. So, oh, sorry. So, yes, I'm responsible to develop service for a clinical trial navigation for the Quebec province, actually. So the service is available through the Fondation Québécoise contre le cancer. So we have a nurse that she was trained by me about clinical research, all the information about clinical trials available in the Quebec province. So as you mentioned, cancer is different from asthma or other diseases. So it's so important to have dedicated service, especially for a clinical trial navigation dedicated to oncology. So we have this service available in the Quebec province, but we have only one person able to answer to the patients or the health professionals. So it's not a lot, but the service, actually we answered to around 150 different requests. So it's a lot, I think, actually. And we are trying to develop this service for all the Canada. So with Dr. Caroline Ham, she has developed a clinical trial navigator service also for the Canada. So we are going to see if we can have the same level and the same quality to be able to answer to the patient or their caregiver or the physician in the Canada to have this service available. But it's very complex to give the right information to the patients, not about the clinical trial, but how the clinical trials is the good option when the patients come to us. Is it the right time, or maybe we have to say the truth? For example, maybe you should come 6 months earlier, or we are sorry, there is no trials available. Maybe you can talk with your physician and see there is maybe other option outside the Canada or the Quebec province. So it's it's a service of information, counseling, and so after all that, we can make a search to see if there is a clinical trial available for the patients. So we have to consider that this service is not only to find, the clinical trial, is to consider the offer of a clinical trial inside the cancer journey. And it's very important for me to teach this information to the navigator. So I'm going to try to see we can offer this at the national level with Dr. Ram and maybe other people interested in this service. Sorry for my English, it's not perfect, but I hope that it's clear. Thank you.
Catherine, do you think there's an opportunity to create a training program,
Yes.
programme de formation pour des personnes qui sont intéressées, a training program for those people who are interested in actually doing this line of work? It might, to me, it seems like it should be an accredited course, even in medicine.
Yes, sure. For example, actually, we have, for example, the basket trial, and it's very complicated to understand that you can have several tumoral sites referred for the same trial, so we have to explain to the patient. It's just an example, but it's very complex. The science under the clinical trials is very complex, and we must find people with, like a master or PhD level, able to answer to the patient, and in the same time, you have the social aspects and the emotional aspects. So, for nurse training, so we must find people able to have all these capacities to be able to offer a good service, to be a good navigator. So it's very important to consider. So a training would be a good option. Yes.
Thank you for that. Stuart, some comments.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common theme that we've heard a lot is about integration, right? How do we integrate things so that they're not reliant on an individual who's an advocate, and then what happens when that individual is no longer there in that position or whatever? So how do we move from that leadership and turn that leadership into embedding that, whatever it is? And that isn't just about clinical trials. I can talk to patient engagement, for example, at our institution. We got some initial funding through SPORE, very fortunate to get support through that. But now we have to look as an institution, okay, that's research funding. What happens when that research funding ends? And again, bigger question about embedding clinical trials, learning health systems. You can't embed research as a continuous thing if the funding is not continuous. So again, we have to sort of think about how do we embed things. But just clear example from the patient engagement work we've done is we looked at what were the systems in place within our institution and how can we embed patient engagement within those so that we didn't create new workflows, we didn't disrupt or add additional workflow. So we looked at things like when our investigators are putting in a new grant, they have to fill in for administrative purposes and what we call an e-notice of intent. So they have to sort of fill in very rudimentary bits of information about the grant, implications for like, is this going to need space, research ethics review, animal care, et cetera, et cetera. So I just said, I didn't know better. I just said, Rob, can we add a question into this? And it was like, sure. So we added a question. Have you or will you engage patients as partners in this research? Yes, no. If yes, then I get an automated email to say this is going to be submitted, and I can reach out to that investigator. I have all the information and say, actually, did you know there's a support service here? This is what we do. And they may not need any help, but we can proactively do that. We have consultation processes in place through our institution where people can reach out to me. But then we also have in our research ethics submissions a question, are patients engaged as partners? And if they say yes, we ask for some more information. So again, we can capture funding, research that's maybe not funded and hasn't consulted us. So we've embedded it in things that the researchers already have to do. And we can capture that data, and then we can use that data to advocate or do whatever and say, look, actually, we've got 70% success rates in grants that have got patients engaged as partners. We've brought in $43 million this year. We've had 180 consultations over the last 2 years, and we can map all this sort of information. So I think embedding it in the processes and integrating it, whether it's integrating sort of navigation, integrating the trials themselves, or anything else, I think is a key piece, so we're not relying on individuals.
Yeah.
Talking about.
And totally agree. And business cases, I think, are another thing, in case you're going to ask. It came up as people in those 4 streams have to learn about how do you write these things and how do you put them in and how do you get the information? There's two things I want to say. Number one, small to medium patient-led organizations have also, in other diseases outside of oncology, put together their own ideation of what they know about clinical trials that are available, and then patients that are looking for clinical trials, and open it to both sides, you know, researchers and patients to look at it and to match up. What has come out of that in some places, mainly in the arthritis space, a lot in the RA or arthritis space, is having patients then do work with researchers, not just to become part of clinical trials, but to write up the clinical trials, to write up the simplified protocols, to get them involved at that point. So I suggest to what Stuart is saying is take it even, all of us, one step closer to the beginning point and have patients embedded right up front. And they're you know, so then people will say, well, you know, that's, you need budget. Yeah, so yes, you do need budget. So how are we going to look at the aspect of needing budget to have a more successful trial if this is what we're trying to do? The other comment I wanted to say, and thank you so much for all the information that you brought forward about registries, it's excellent, and I'd love to partner with you with CanTrain and look at something, because there's a few groups that have asked, and Barry obviously was going to be getting us together anyway. However, I think a lot of foundational stuff starts with education. People don't even know what they need to be educated in because they don't even know what this is. They don't even realize it's something that might affect their loved one, for to speak, or might affect their life. All of a sudden, you didn't expect your life story to change. I didn't expect mine to change. So how do we get it into people's mind? And they say that out of the top 10 things to do to change something, education's important, but it's number 10. So it's the worst off trying to get people to do something. However, it's necessary, and if we don't do it and if we don't educate and train, we can't go on to the other aspects. So my question, rhetorical right now, is how do we get these small organizations across the country that are already starting to create their own registries of what clinical trials are available and patients available to partner or to be participants in them, to registries like that, and putting them together in a bigger way?
That it's 3:15, actually, 3:17. I've received your brainwaves. So any final, very brief last words from folks on this panel here?
I was just going to say, I was going to echo what you said there, Linda, in terms of getting patients involved from the protocols, like very early on, as opposed to your experience where you're brought in quite late, it sounds like, right? So, yeah, so I think part of it is actually finding funding mechanisms for that as an investigator. So we do it because we have the capacity to do it. We have great people like Stuart on our team even to help facilitate these things very, very early on. The vast majority of academic researchers don't. So, so I think there's some funding mechanisms for that to happen, or even for the patient organization level, reaching out and saying we have some people who would be, because part of it's funding as well too, right? Just to fund the patient involvement, but if there's some volunteerism up front, even that might help promote some of these things as well too. So,
and the very important role that patient groups can play in all of this as well. So I would like to then bring this panel to a close and thank each and every one of you for your participation and the great discussion. So thank you. Thank you.